Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Um, Thank you for coming this evening to hear a talk by Professor Ruth Harper and Kadari. Um, Professor Harper and Kadari has works at Bar-Ilan University and has had a distinguished academic career working in the field of women's rights. She founded the Center at Bar-Ilan University, which addresses these issues, and her work has been recognized both in Israel and outside, where she's been the was one of the supposed to be the most one of the most 100 most influential people in the field of study that she devotes her time to. Um, this is the background, of course. The foreground is that she has taken on the task of setting up the organization called DINA, which was looking at the violations of women's rights and the violence to women, which occurred on October the 7th and related matters. And I'm sure everybody who's on this call knows that she was the person who took the cases right through from documenting them to presentation to the United Nations. Um, she was supposed to be taking a sabbatical in the United States, and as she's told me, she's at NYU now and has eventually managed to get there. But of course, these events which affect all of us, have taken over to a certain extent, and she doesn't seem like she's going to have as much of a sabbatical as she really deserves on the basis of her previous work. Fortunately, she's being given an honorary degree by Brandeis University, which at least is some compensation in the recognition of her really quite remarkable achievements. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Harper and Kadari and ask her to give her presentation to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, for these kind words and kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to present to you this afternoon, I guess, in the UK, or evening rather. And I'm really I'm grateful for any opportunity that I have to raise awareness and to tell the story, to bring the voices of those who are no longer able to speak, but also to, I would say very, very carefully, to mend some inaccuracies in everything that we had experienced on October 7th and its aftermath. So the structure of my presentation, and I am already saying right at the beginning, I'm not sure that I will get to each and every point that I detailed here. But when I think about these issues on a more academic, analytical level, I understand that what we're dealing with is, on a deeper level, is questions of formation of knowledge, of what do what do we know about what happened on October 7th from the perspective of sexual violence and gender atrocities. How do we know what we know? And what do we not know? And what will we never know? What will never be known? And then that's the trickiest, what we think that we know, but it's actually not quite exactly so, not exactly as we think that we know. And then the biggest question is, what are we to make of all this? So as I said, I don't think I will cover all the theoretical aspects of these important questions, but let's first start with what we know. And what we know now is a lot more than what we had known until a week ago. And I speak now in the plural sense because as was mentioned in the introduction, I found myself very much involved in the whole work of documenting, of finding evidence and documenting and structuring the pieces, all the pieces in the puzzle of the question of sexual violence of October 7th. I found myself very much immersed in it from October 8th. And the person that you see here, whom I'm standing next to, is Pramila Patten. She's the special representative of the Secretary General of the UN on sexual violence in conflict, to whom I reached out already on October 8th. After realizing that Hamas had so many hours uninterrupted in so many locations at the southern part of Israel before the IDF started fighting back. And I had known Ms. Patton from our previous work together on the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW committee. I was there for 12 years. I was also the vice chair of the committee, and Pramila was there also for a number of years before she assumed this position of the Undersecretary General of the United Nations. And going back to that Sunday after the Black Saturday, I realized that in most probability, and based on everything that I had known, again, from my years on CEDAW, hearing from victims, from survivors of so many other unfortunate places in the world, such as Bosnia or Rwanda or DRC, Darfur, the Yazidi women, there was no question in my mind that in most probability, Hamas also committed atrocities in the nature of violence against women and sexual violence against women. And so I reached out to Ms. Patton, and we started a long process of which culminated in her conducting a fact-finding mission into Israel in February, at the end of January and February. She came for a week. Her team stayed for 10 more days. And exactly a week ago, she published her findings. And what I put here in this slide is the outcome, the bottom line of the findings of her report in the context of the coordinated attack. And it's very important to know that it was a coordinated attack. That is the finding of the UN report. The UN mission team found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred in multiple locations, including rape and gang rape in at least 3 locations in southern Israel. And these locations involved more than one incident of rape and gang rape, which was verified by this UN team. And I stress the words verified because this team employed a very rigorous and rigid methodology of every piece of evidence had to be corroborated by another independent piece of evidence before they concluded that it can be included in the report. So when I describe what the information that I have, I sometimes refer to other instances and other incidents, other cases of sexual violence that have not been included in the UN report because they perhaps rely only on one source. And the UN team was very careful, as I said, to corroborate everything by at least 2 independent sources. And the next important finding is that they found a pattern of victims, mostly women, found fully or partially naked, bound, and shot across multiple locations, which may be indicative of some form of sexual violence. And the word pattern here is also important because it indicates systematic nature of committing of the sexual violence. And the saddest finding is with respect to the hostages, sorry, where the mission team found clear and convincing information that some have been subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and sexualized torture and sexualized, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And it also has reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may be ongoing. And I ask everybody here to pause for a moment and to think about this truth that as we are speaking now, there still are 134 hostages in Hamas captivity, including 19 young women which had been subjected to sexual violence on October 7, and this sexual violence still goes on as we speak, and we know that for a fact. So how do we know everything that we know? How did the UN team find out all the information that was contained in their report? There are survivors. I know that one of the arguments that is being raised against us and against Israel is how come there are no survivors to speak up about what they had been through on October 7. And again, one of the arguments that is being raised to deny the sexual violence of October 7th is that in all other cases, such as Ukraine or Bosnia or Rwanda, there were women who came forward and said, I had been raped, I was attacked, I was assaulted. And as Ms. Patton told me that she was criticized by people who were saying, how come only in Israel, very conveniently, all the victims were killed? Well, the truth is that most of the victims of sexual violence of October 7th had been murdered immediately after, sometimes during the attack, the assault itself. And those that survived were mostly taken to Gaza. But there are a few who remained alive in Israel. However, they are not in a position to speak, not now, and there's no way of knowing whether they will ever be able to speak and to come and to tell us what they had endured. But I did talk to a few therapists who treat the survivors, and I was given very basic details about what they had been through, their ages, the numbers, where they come from. And this is also very important because they're not only from the Nova Music Festival, they're also from at least 2 other kibbutzim in the area. And that also proves the systemic nature of the attack and the widespread nature, the fact that it happened in more than one location at the same time and the same nature of the attack. So we have survivors. The released hostages, they speak up now. We'll see that in a moment. And then there are eyewitnesses who witnessed the attacks in real time, and they started coming forward several weeks after October 7. And there still are many, many more testimonies of eyewitnesses that come up now. And it's also important to note that many of them are not even aware that they are witnesses, that their story is important, that their story may serve as a ground for, it's an investigation material. It can serve as ground for pursuing criminal proceedings. Then there are the testimonies of all the first responders, the Zaka people who had the task of collecting the bodies from that battleground, and those people who worked in the Shura military base that was turned into a morgue. I spoke to a number of them, and their description of what went on those first days after, on October 7th and afterwards, is just beyond any imagination. It's describing scenes from hell, which also is very much related to the question of what we don't know because we don't have. We don't have concrete or traditional forensic evidence in the sense of forensic examinations that are usually used to verify sexual assaults for the very grim and simple reason that it was not relevant to perform these kind of tests or examinations on October 7, 8, or 9, or even 10, because it was still a battleground. The bodies were collected under fire. It was not a crime scene, it was a war scene. And the very first task of the people who worked in Shura was to identify all the casualties and to bring some solace to those thousands of families who stormed the military base wanting to know if their loved ones are dead, or if they survived, or if they're taken to hospital, or maybe taken hostage to Gaza. And then we also have the testimony of medical and healthcare professionals who treat the hostages that returned and who also treat those survivors who, as I mentioned, who survived in Israel. So this is the basis for the first-hand testimonies. And I just put here a few slides with few quotations. This is from a very young woman, the 17 years old Agam Goldstein, who was held captive with her mother and younger brother, whose father and older sister were murdered on October 7. And Agam and her mother and brother were released in the first hostage deal after 50 days in captivity. And she tells the whole world what she heard from the other young women who had been held there. And there are other testimonies by released hostages. This is a testimony of the first eyewitness who came forward about a month after October 7. Her testimony was released by the police on November 14. And remember this date in mind, because we're going to have a look at the reaction of the world. And in my opinion, this is a very determinative date to remember. So you can read the description here. She gave an extremely detailed, graphic description of what she witnessed. More than one gang rape. This is just one excerpt from her testimony. I watched the whole testimony with the police. She was taken by the police to the area of the Nova Music Festival where she fled from. She found the bushes in which she hid, and she spotted the place where the rapes took place. And the police found some personal items there, which, as I said, it corroborates her testimony. And notice the very extreme brutality and cruelty of mutilation, which is described in this paragraph. And this is also paradigmatic of the crimes and the atrocities that were committed by Hamas on October 7. Another eyewitness testimony by first responder, not in real time, but a first responder a paramedic that was part of the task forces that were tasked with rescuing. But what they mostly did is to collect the bodies and to make sure that the terrorists are no longer there. So you can read the description here as well. And then this is testimony of Sherry Mendez, who is a volunteer in the Shura military base in the part of the base was divided into the civil section and the military section. And in the military section, there was a group of women who were in charge of handling the bodies of the female soldiers who were killed in the attack. And their task was to identify, and this is how she describes how the bodies, in the condition of the bodies of the female soldiers as they were brought to the morgue. I was shown photographs that were taken in this military part of the morgue. And I will just mention here that many of the much of the information that I am providing relies on materials from the investigation itself and from the formal authorities that engage in this investigation, the police and the IDF and the Shin Bet, because, as was mentioned in the introduction, I had the opportunity to be invited by several UN agencies and entities to brief them, including the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And I also accompanied the special representative of the Secretary General in her fact-finding mission. And so I had access to many parts of the information that was not published in the media or in the press. So going back to those photographs, which obviously I cannot show, but they match the description of what we see here, the testimony of Sherry Mendez, and they also indicate what she refers to as shots in the intimate areas, shots that were targeting the sexual organs of the female soldiers, and some also of male soldiers. And talking about photographs, the other kind of information and of evidence that we have is the footage that comes from the terrorists' GoPro cameras or private phones, whether it is the private phones of the victims or the private phones of the terrorists themselves that were captured. And then there are many, many photographs and footage taken by first responders as they collected the bodies, surveillance cameras, and then also footage brought from Gaza, from the terrorists that managed to escape to Gaza. And I will not describe what we see here. I think everybody can see for themselves. I can just say that I had seen many pictures of what we describe as bodies that speak, namely bodies that were found all in a very similar position, a pattern, as I quoted from in the beginning from the special representative's report, pattern of bodies of women, either fully naked or naked from the waist down, with legs spread, very often with blood from the lower part of their bodies, clearly indicating what went on before they were murdered. And these blood, the bottom of the body, is obviously what stayed, I think, in the minds of everybody who watched. On the right-hand side, the horrific clip of Naama Levy, who, as she was being taken, pulled to the truck from the back of the van to the van itself with large blood stains on her sweatpants. And this is similar to the images of the two women that we see here on the left side, who were found at the Nova Music Festival. And the mutilation of Shani Locke, she was identified very early on, so I can say the name. And again, as I said, these are just small examples of all the footage that that we have, and more footage that I was also shown from Hamas cameras. Now, I want to go back to the question of the reaction of the world. What did the world know? When did the world know it? And how did it react? So some of us, myself, together with Professor Francis Radai, who was also a former CEDAW member in the 2000s, we reached out to the CEDAW committee, to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, to UN Women, to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, to the Special Rapporteur on Enforced Disappearances, and to numerous other UN agencies and entities on October 9. And we wrote them letters, emails, delineating all the information that was already out there. And I have to say, it was only information in the form of media reports, of newspaper reports. But those reports, sorry, I have to raise my hand so that the light will come on again. Newspaper reports that recounted what people were saying after October 7, but there was already enough information to raise concern about the possibility that sexual violence was committed by Hamas during the massacre of October 7, and the need to investigate it and the need to look into that in a similar way to other statements that these bodies issued in other instances of reports of sexual violence in conflict, such as in Ukraine, such as in South Sudan, such as in Syria, against Yazidi women by ISIS, etc., etc. That's what we expected when we sent out these letters and these emails, and it was already on the first week of the war. And that was before Israel started its attack on Gaza in its justified self-defense attack following the massacre of October 7. UN Women came out with 4 statements in the first month of the war, and only one of them mentioned the hostages. And here you can see summary, not of statements, but of tweets that were published by UN Women during the first 6 weeks of the war. The majority of them talk about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and they are all one-sided against Israel. Only 5 of them are balanced. None of the tweets mentions the hostages. And none of the tweets mentions Hamas or Hamas being a terror organization. And a similar picture arises when we look at the tweets that the World Health Organization issued, although they did mention the hostages in 2 of their tweets, 2 out of 106, in the first 5 weeks of the war. And a similar picture, perhaps even worse picture, emerges when we examine UNICEF tweets, again, the first 5 weeks of the war. So what does that leave us with? Maybe, as I've seen in other media outlets, mostly those that identify with Palestinians, maybe this is because there was not enough evidence. Maybe this is because, as I said before, there were no survivors to testify about what happened to them. Maybe it is because there was no forensic evidence. So I can live with that until the first eyewitness account came out and was released by the police. And that was, as I said, on November 14. That is 5 weeks after October 7. And then the CNN report that was released on November 16. And then the rest of the world media joined in. And probably there was the Sunday Times major investigation by Christina Lamb on, I think it was December 1st. And then the New York Times investigation that was published towards the end of December, maybe December 23rd. But after that, after November 14, that is where the tone should have completely changed. And when I compare the reaction of UN Women towards the attack on Israel of October 7 to other similar events where concerns about sexual violence as a weapon of war, when concerns about using rape as a tool of war were raised in other conflict areas, in other similar cases, such as with Ukraine, I see that UN Women reacted very quickly, not after the Russian invasion into Ukraine. That's not the equivalent. The equivalent is the Bucha massacre. The equivalent is how long it took UN Women to react after the Russian forces withdrew from Bucha and testimonies and evidence started emerging about the massacre there and about the sexual violence that was committed there. And it took them 2 to 3 days to react. And here it took them almost 8 weeks to mention for the first time that they are concerned with reports of grave sexual violence that was committed by Hamas on October 7. So there is clear difference in their reaction. But again, the picture is more complicated than that, because it is true that the task of building up the information and building up the basis of knowledge is a very specific, a very difficult, a very demanding task. We are encountered by memory failures, and we are also encountered by fake. There is, I wouldn't say a lot, but there is also fake that was being spread around. And this is another point that the secretary, the special representative of the Secretary General makes in her report to to debunk at least two reports that had been widely shared in the media and were proved to be wrong. And it is important to be very, very careful and not to repeat any of the refuted information and the refuted reports, because by reporting one fake piece of information, we risk the decreditization and delegitimization of all the information that we provide. We have to be aware that the war that goes on now is not only the war in Gaza with its devastation over Palestinians, over innocent Palestinians in Gaza, including women and children, and its ramifications on Israel. The other war that goes on, and it started immediately after October 7, is the war over the narrative. And the war over the narrative builds on these attributes of memory failures and of fake. And the war over narrative also builds on the issue of the politicization of knowledge building. And part of this politicization is also the story about the silence, because the silence is not a monolithic picture. There were some entities within the UN who did not keep silent and who acted immediately. There were special rapporteurs on torture and on extrajudicial killings that did speak up and did mention their concern about the sexual violence of Hamas and the need to investigate and the need to condemn and the fact that Hamas committed crimes against humanity. And then there was, as I already mentioned all along, the special representative of the Secretary General, who asked already at the end of, in mid-November, asked to be invited to conduct an investigation, to conduct this fact-finding mission. And in her words, she said, to amplify the voices of the victims and to be the voice for those who can no longer speak. So we have to recall this. The picture is more nuanced than what some of us want to argue. And I just want to conclude by introducing the project that I'm part of. It's the DINA project. We're 5 women who, I would say, just started working together in a very ad hoc manner. Very early on after October 7, each one of us comes from a different area of specialization. I come with my knowledge of the international arena and my position in the international human rights arena and my connections. And we see it as our goal to uncover, to amplify the voices, to raise awareness, both on the level of the Israeli authorities, including the prosecutor's office, the police, the health ministry, and on the level of the international human rights world. So I think we can perhaps leave now some time for questions. So I refer back to you, David.
Thank you. And thank you for a remarkable presentation. We've been running presentations like this for a number of years since COVID, and I think this is perhaps the most remarkable that we've heard, not only for the detail, but also for the way you presented it and the way you placed it in the context of events. A couple of questions do spring to mind immediately. One of them is about the special representative. What was particular about her compared to the other organizations that made her take on the task? We can congratulate the UN, but but we really, it is a uh, remarkable episode.
Yes, it is quite unprecedented, and it's quite complex. We have to first of all understand that the UN also is not one monolithic entity. There are numerous organizations, agencies, entities within the UN, and there's the political branch, and then there's the human rights branch. I mentioned that I reached out to the CEDAW committee or the CRC. These are on the human rights branch. They mostly act from Geneva. The political branch of the UN acts from New York under the Secretary General. And the Secretary General each year issues an annual report that supposedly covers everything that the UN did in that year. And it always contains a chapter on sexual violence in conflict. Most of us do not think about it, but at present, there are 25 areas of conflict in the world, of ongoing conflicts in the world, where sexual violence is used as a weapon of war, again, as we speak. So this chapter in the annual report is the chapter that the special representative, Pramila Patten, is in charge of. So she collects the information, she passes it on to the Secretary General, and he includes it in his annual report. And he also comes up with conclusions such as blacklist of entities or organizations that permit or condone or even commit sexual violence as a weapon of war, sexual violence in conflict. However, in all the other areas of conflict areas, there already are UN entities on the ground that do the investigations, that collect the information, what we call UN verified information, not in Israel, because Israel does not permit those UN entities, such as a commission of inquiries that was established in 2020. It is headed by Navi Pillai, and Israel has no trust in that commission of inquiry. Israel has no trust in other UN entities. We can argue about that, whether this attitude is justified or not justified. It doesn't matter. The fact is that there are no UN entities in Israel to conduct this investigation. So the outcome might have been that the Secretary General publishes his 2023 report, annual report, with a chapter on sexual violence in conflict and no mention of Israel of October 7, no mention of Hamas. Now, this is, of course, unacceptable. It would really be a catastrophe. And that is how we, and I did play a major role in that, managed to convince Israel's authorities, the politicians, the decision makers, to allow this specific entity, this specific mandate of the special representative on sexual violence in conflict, because her mandate is limited only to sexual violence in conflict, not to other war crimes, not to other crimes against humanity. And she was accorded with specific expanded team so that she's able to collect information and to verify it. And the outcome, I think, is very, very positive. I believe that after this report, it is no longer possible to simply deny, to simply say that it didn't happen, or to say that we didn't know, or to say that there is no evidence. It's not possible. We have the highest authority of the UN, the most solid report, the most carefully collected evidence. Conclude the conclusions that I put at the beginning of the presentation, and most alarmingly about the hostages. And this is what should now play the most significant card in the negotiations over the release of the hostages. They are still being tortured and sexually assaulted as we speak.
I mean, it is an extraordinary story. The one question is about the evidence, the actual physical evidence of these episodes. Um, how much on the um, bodies that were found and there's how much physical evidence was there, and where was it collected, and was that accepted by the UN?
So we don't know. This is part of those questions that I said we don't know and we will never know.
Hmm.
Because as I explained, it was still a battlefield and the bodies were collected under fire,
Hmm.
and nobody was able or was or could collect the physical evidence from the ground as what would be expected if it were a regular crime scene of
Right,
sexual assaults.
right,
However, in the morgue, some might argue that more could have been done in terms of taking pictures of the full bodies. Because as I mentioned, pictures were taken in the military section of the morgue, but not in the civil section of the morgue.
right.
Now, this is something that I have to admit, I still have some, I don't know how to say that, some criticism. I think that maybe a day after or maybe 2 days after, we already tried to alert the attention of the authorities that there is concern about sexual violence, that they should be mindful of that, that they should do their utmost to still to collect, not to perform the forensic exams. This would also go against the Jewish tradition, and against the need to bury the bodies as quickly as possible, to identify and to bury as quickly as possible. But taking pictures of the full body is something that could have been done, and it wasn't done. So the
Yeah.
evidence, the forensic evidence, was actually buried with the victims.
Right, which is understandable and under those particular circumstances. And coming, you showed the team that were working with you. The team that were working with you, were they based from Bar Ilan, or were they from multiple places in Israel?
Multiple places. One of them is a former deputy solicitor general, also a former district court judge, Nava Ben Or. The other is a former prosecutor general of the army, of the IDF, Colonel Sharon Zagagi Pinchas. Then the third is we're all formers, and that's important because we are no longer civil servants, so we are obviously free to act, and we're not government. So former CEO of the authority of the National Authority for the Advancement of Women, and the fourth one is currently the CEO of Israel's Women Network. So it's a combination of civil society and academia. I'm a combination also for academia, and we are all very, very experienced and experts in our fields, also in criminal law. It's very, very important. Much of the work that we are now doing is to formulate the specifics of criminal legal theory that will allow to proceed with criminal proceedings against those terrorists that are captured and are in Israel's custody now. Because under traditional criminal law theory, to prove or to prosecute for sexual violence, there has to be the possibility of connecting a specific perpetrator with a specific victim. Now, I think we all understand that is not possible to do this in this case. So the challenge is how to develop a theory of collective responsibility, even to these kinds of crimes of sexual violence. So this is something that our team is working on in engaging with Israel's prosecution authorities, and also by learning from comparative experience of other similar cases. We want to be able to assist in international proceedings as they may come along. There is also the possibility of universal jurisdiction. There's also the possibility of bringing charges not only on the ICC, but also in several other places where victims are nationals of, for example, of US or of Canada or of France. Again, our experience in criminal law is something that can assist in that, bringing justice in various ways.
You mentioned the civil society bodies that failed to respond. What about international women's organizations or national women's organizations? Has there been any response from those? I don't know who the response would go to, for example. Would it go to Israeli women's organizations or to you? How does that work?
They don't need to contact us directly. We expected them to issue statements, to issue something on the web to show solidarity, to address this on the day, the 25th of November is the International Day of Combating Violence Against Women, 25th of November. There was a previous date, 25th of October. That was the commemoration of the adoption of Security Council Resolution number 1325, which was adopted in the year 2000 and is a milestone in promoting international women's rights and protecting women from violence, especially during conflict time. So we expected all these organizations to acknowledge that just now the world had witnessed a horrible attack on the integrity of women, and the most recent and horrific, atrocious example of using the bodies of women as a weapon of war. That's what we expected them to do, and they did not. This is really a betrayal of very, very difficult to reckon and to come to terms with. Now, of course, I'm being a little too general. There had been some sporadic light that came out from various directions in the US mostly. But most of the women's organizations and the international human rights really disappointed us. And I'll just mention one more thing, going back to UN Women, which is really, I think, the most shameful and disgraceful reaction in their silence and in their very, very delayed response. The fact that they didn't say anything now after the publication of the special representative's report is also very, very telling. I think that it's really undermining the whole justification for their existence. It's betrayal, not just of us, but of all the women in the world. It sends a message that these kind of crimes and atrocities might be legitimate in certain contexts and might even be legitimate as we heard, as a form of resistance. And this is a terribly, terribly concerning message that must be stopped.
They've got other questions come up on the quick Q&A. The great one question is about tahara, about the question of washing away uh, religious preparation, washing away of evidence. That's one question. The other question about legislative change to allow second-hand reporting, hearsay with regard to conspiracy law.
I'm not sure I understand the first question.
Whether tahara, whether some
The
of
tahara, the tahara.
tahara.
Look, as I said, they were not the need to collect forensic evidence in the sense of evidence of sexual violence was not part of the protocol of treating the bodies. And it was not part of that for two reasons. One is that people were not aware of it. None of the commanders, none of the decision makers gave orders to look for that and to be mindful of that. And the second is that the priority, the number one priority was identification and bringing to burial. 1,200 casualties in one day is something that nobody was ever prepared for, not in the worst scenarios, not in the worst nightmares. So the question is really not,
Yeah.
it wasn't relevant.
And the question
changing the laws, yes, this is exactly one of the directions that we're going in, to change the hearsay. For instance, on the ICC, the International Criminal Court, hearsay is allowed, and it can be used. So this is exactly one of the directions that we want to pursue and that we want to convince the Israeli authorities to consider, so that these theories of conspiracy and collective responsibility, criminal enterprise, can be employed with respect to these kind of crimes also.
And the other question is about Islamic law and sexual violence, which is I don't know whether you want to answer and address
so
that.
That's a topic for a whole different lecture, of course,
Yeah.
and it's something that I'm also struggling with. I'll answer that simply by saying ISIS are supposedly also devoted Muslims. Boko Haram are supposedly also devoted Muslims. So the fact that Islamic law forbids sexual violence is no argument to deny the sexual violence that was committed by Hamas on October 7.
Right. Okay. And one of the other questions that has been raised is the question of were any of the victims of sexual violence not Jewish? In other words,
again, we do not know exactly the identity of those who were sexually violated. Among the hostages, the young women hostages, they're all Jewish. Among those who were murdered, we don't know.
Yeah.
We simply will never know.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like, although DNA was a specific project, and as you illustrated, is related to a specific terminology, this work is an ongoing project, which is going to continue.
Yes.
Is your group going to be satisfactorily resourced, and how can it be resourced?
So the group is now formally part of the Rachman Center that I'm heading at Bar-Ilan Faculty of Law. And in fact, we are actually, coincidentally, we are launching a crowdfunding campaign next week. So if people want to partner with us and to help us in having some minimal resources to continue this particular work, I invite you to go on the website of Bar-Ilan University, the Rachman Center. Maybe I'll send you the details for that later. So maybe you can also send it if people are interested.
That,
Thank you.
that,
Thank you for asking that.
that was not an intentional question and one that we'd prepared beforehand. But
Definitely
I
not.
think it's a very relevant question, and an important issue. And I noticed that the reason why we started at 7:30 specifically tonight was because we were told you had another engagement following
Right.
on. So
Right.
I think it's about time we gave you a break um, from your efforts, and to wish you good luck and much success with your future endeavors, as well as in enjoying your sabbatical. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.